All right, now let's dive into the Setty report here, Madhava. I know you got something to say here about this Washington Post piece that discusses the unseen COVID-19 risk for unvaccinated people. What do you have to break down for us here today?
Yes, it's an interesting discussion that I hope to have here, and I just want to preface it by first saying I'm not in this to destabilize any positions. I'm doing this as a physician that has nothing to gain here except bringing clarity to a very complex situation. That's number one. And number two, I know this audience is very alert and aware of the fact that there is distortion coming from the mainstream media. And so I don't mean to talk down to any one of your audience. I'm really just trying to offer a way to look more deeply and to find out where are the sources of distortion coming from the mainstream media here so that we can educate each other and educate our friends who may be on the fence. So that is the intent of pretty much all the content that I offer your audience.
That's it. That's all well said. So let's take it from the beginning. What's going on with this piece from the Washington Post?
Well, I would say the first thing that caught my attention was that the Washington Post put up a interesting ad. It's an ad on Facebook talking about the risk of the unvaccinated. And right away, that caught my attention. And I think you actually can talk more about why that is odd.
Hmm. Yeah. So essentially, the Washington Post writes an article about the unseen damages of, well, I should say the unseen risk of unvaccinated people. And what I found interesting about them running that as an ad is when you run it as an ad, it essentially means that you're not getting enough organic traffic to the particular piece of content. Yet you deem this piece of content so utterly important that you're willing to put money behind it. But I gotta say, it is rare to have a news organization actually put advertising or promotion behind a particular piece of content unless there's some sort of vested interest there. I'm not saying it's impossible that they would be, promoting a piece of content that they're not gaining anything from, but it seems like they've sided with a particular stance. And in this particular case, they're aggressively siding with the go get vaccinated stance, and that unvaccinated people pose a particular risk. So to me, it seemed like a little odd that an apparently objective news organization who hasn't really reported on, the legitimate potential concerns related to this vaccine. And not only have they not really reported on that, but they're also now promoting with advertising a narrative that says, go get vaccinated.
That's exactly right. When it flashed on my Facebook feed, I noticed that it had 3.8 thousand shares and several thousand comments. But what brought my attention to it was that this particular piece was being used to argue for the pro vaccination perspective in some of the exchanges I was having on Facebook. And so that led me to really take a hard look at what this article was saying. And I was stupefied, to be honest with you. Right away, we have to consider it carefully because it is the Washington Post. So this is a publication that has millions in its readership. And what really caught my eye about the whole thing is that they seem to make comparisons between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals and how they're contributing to the spread of the pandemic now that we have vaccinations available. And I'm extremely focused on these kinds of data because we don't really know what those numbers are because we haven't completed phase 3 trials. So when the Washington Post comes forward and says, look, there's a big difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, bing, that's where I'm all ears. Like, tell me what you know. And that's why it's significant. And what I'd like to do here is demonstrate where the distortion is, because they're making some bold statements with bold imagery. And are they really backing it up? And that's what I'd like to demonstrate here is they're not backing it up. They're making big assumptions, and they're not being transparent with the assumptions that they're making. And this piece, as I will demonstrate, is propaganda, and it's interweaving a lot of narratives that are unsubstantiated, and making statements and conclusions from respected and credentialed individuals to back them up. All right, I'm going to step through this quickly. And as we see right from the get-go, they're demonstrating that the U.S. average in daily new cases is plummeting. From January to May, it's something like, I don't know, 8 cases per 100,000 a day, which is great. But what they're trying to say here is don't get too complacent. Then as you scroll down, they show you what's happening in Washington State. And Washington State's overall case rate was better, and now it's about the same. Then, this is where it gets very interesting, is they underline the statement, Washington's cases among unvaccinated people. And you see in orange, that's their color of choice, warning, that the unvaccinated population is doing much worse than the rest of the state. And this is a common theme in this piece, is that they are demonstrating, or they seem to demonstrate, that the unvaccinated people are doing much, much worse than the population as a whole. So what I would like to offer all of you is to first ask yourself, did they actually add up the number of unvaccinated people that are getting sick and compare that to the vaccinated people that are getting sick? I would assume that to the casual reader, they would make that assumption that, oh, well, we have the unvaccinated people that are getting more sick than the vaccinated people. But in fact, as I will demonstrate, that's not what they're doing at all. They are using an assumption that if you are vaccinated, there's only a 15% chance that you're getting sick. And this is based on a CDC weekly report that was hidden and embedded in their methodology. They are assuming that only 15% of the vaccinated part of the population is contributing to the cases. Based on that assumption, that's how they draw every single graph on this piece. So I hope you understand something here. This is pure circular reasoning, because they're implying that in each state that we're about to see here, the unvaccinated people are doing much worse than the vaccinated. They're not actually counting up the number of people who are getting sick who are unvaccinated. They're just assuming that the unvaccinated are contributing to 85% of the cases. And if you don't pick up on that right away, you will jump to the conclusion that, holy moly, if I don't get vaccinated, I'm going to be contributing to the problem. The next graphic states, these adjusted numbers paint a far less optimistic picture. Washington's case rate among unvaccinated people is as high as it was in late January, near the peak of COVID infections. Can you see what they're saying? The case rate among unvaccinated people. That means if you look at the number of unvaccinated people who are sick and divide it by the total number of unvaccinated people, that's how you get the case rate among unvaccinated people. Did they actually do that? They did not. They never added up who got sick who was unvaccinated. They assume that of the total number of cases, most of it was contributed by unvaccinated people. Do you see the distortion here, Joe?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's even more stupefying is that as we scroll down, and they put up finally you see the title of the piece, the unseen COVID-19 risk for unvaccinated people. It's interesting, right? Because they use the word unseen, which is peculiar, because in fact it is unseen. They didn't really show us what they're doing. So I found that to be slightly amusing, if you will, if it wasn't such a serious topic. And then state after state, they demonstrate that the unvaccinated population is doing much worse. But they don't really call it the unvaccinated. They call it the rate adjusted for vaccinations. This is where the deception lies, because they're making a mathematical calculation based on an assumption that if you are vaccinated, there's only a 15% chance that you are going to get sick. That's an assumption. They're not counting things up. And that assumption, as I said before, is based on a very small study that came out in the CDC, looking, interestingly, at frontline workers and healthcare providers who are exposed to a great number of sick people. That's what they do. So this is, right away you have to say, that's not a normal swath of the population we're looking at. We're looking at people who are exposed to this virus a lot more than the average person. And then they came up with that particular number. So that itself is a huge assumption, because they're applying it not just to healthcare providers, they're applying it to state after state after state after state, making the same assumption that only 15% of the vaccinated people are contributing to the caseload in those places. That is an enormous assumption. But unless you read the methodology section, you will be fooled. Now, we're going to move beyond cases and look at average new daily deaths per 1 million residents. Okay? And now they're using purple to demonstrate the rate adjusted for vaccinations. Let's look at this closely. We're looking at Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Illinois. Beyond the fact that these two graphs are diverging, these two plots are diverging, look at the absolute scale. In other words, what is the y-axis? 5, 10, 15, what is that? That is the number of deaths per day per million. Per million. And look, every death is a tragedy. At least every preventable death is a tragedy. I'm not saying that we should throw away deaths because there's so few. I'm saying let's look at the absolute difference that the vaccine purportedly is contributing to. And like if you look at, for example, Pennsylvania, and you look at the purple graph, the average daily death rate on May 26th in Pennsylvania in the adjusted unvaccinated population is about 4 compared to 3 in the total population. So we're talking about 1 death in a million people. So that is something to keep in mind, is that we need to look at what is the absolute risk of these things and how good is the vaccine doing in reducing absolute risk. Nonetheless, the distortion is coming from the fact that they're not actually adding up the number of unvaccinated people that died on a given day. They're not. They're just assuming that it must be mainly due to the unvaccinated population. The other interesting thing to note here is that, as I said, this was based on a CDC weekly report, which is not peer-reviewed, number one. But that report only dealt with cases, not with deaths. How is it that they can make the same assumption for deaths? They can't. But they're doing it anyway, and they're putting it right in our faces that, look, there's a difference in deaths too. There isn't, or at least we don't know, but they're suggesting that there is, and suggesting is a very kind way to put it. They're actually telling us that that's what's going on. That's what's so concerning about this to me. And then finally, we get down to hospitalizations. And notice again that the difference, say, in District of Columbia, Maryland, Florida, Rhode Island, they all mirror deaths in terms of the difference between the two populations. And they all mirror cases. Why? It's because they make the same assumption in all of this data. All they have is the total number of cases, the total number of hospitalizations, and the total number of deaths. And they make the same mathematical assumption in each case. That's why the graphs look the same. They're not counting things up. Now, they finally end this piece with a quote from a public epidemiologist in Washington State, whose name is Umair Shah, I believe. And this is his quote at the end of the article, to really drive it home. The people who are not vaccinated are the ones who are not wearing a mask or washing their hands. Those are the very people who oftentimes will socialize and be around similar, like-minded people. You're going to have the pandemic continue in those clusters. What is this doctor saying? I mean, just think about this. Let this sink in for a moment. He's saying that people who don't get vaccinated are the ones not wearing their masks. I mean, how can an epidemiologist make that statement unless he has surveyed these people? And, there's surveillance and there's surveying. He did neither one of these things. He did not actually go and ask people who are unvaccinated whether they go off into public without washing their hands. It's an incredibly bold statement, but notice how the Washington Post in this piece is setting up this narrative, right? How is a Washington Post subscriber, someone who believes in this publication, going to leave after reading this? They're going to basically assume that they're doing the right thing, and those who don't get vaccinated are the danger, and they're being irresponsible. Talk about being irresponsible. This is a very, very irresponsible claim, and one that should not get attention or be platformed by the Washington Post. And Joe, I'm guessing that you have something to say about this, because where are the fact checkers?
One of the things that I'm like hearing here that I find interesting is like the way they're applying the logic here. If this were sort of the other way around, and I think we've seen this a lot lately, but if this were the other way around, where alternative media sources were trying to make an argument that was perhaps using the same type of reasoning, fact checker would have dove on top of this immediately and said, look, this is misleading. This is missing context. And they would try to debunk this whole situation. But we're not seeing that applied here with this Washington Post piece. And not only that, but this piece is being advertised. It's not only being advertised on Facebook, but it's being advertised on Twitter. And it's sending a message to the population that, like you were saying, it suggests, hey, this all makes sense. And the unvaccinated people have a huge risk. And yet there's a lot of assumptions being made in this piece. And just hearing what you're saying, this is one of the challenges I think that's existed throughout this whole pandemic is a lot of things don't make sense. And when people think about them and provide a little more context, like you just did, it's like nobody hears about it. And instead the mainstream narrative continues on until it takes a year for it to be debunked and they recognize, oh yeah, you might actually be right. And then they play it off as like, well, we just learned something brand new. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It can feel frustrating.
Yeah, it is frustrating. And the reason why it's so disturbing, not only is it because, as you pointed out, that the Washington Post is pushing the story, paying for ads on Facebook, but it's the Washington Post. So for the casual reader who doesn't, consider that the fact that there's another way of looking at things here, they just grant legitimacy to the Washington Post position because it's the Washington Post.
Right.
And I think this is very important because, the biggest story that's happened in the last week and a half, or actually the last month, is the story about Fauci's emails and lab origins that all came out very recently. People have been talking about this for a long time, and by people I'm talking about, actual research scientists from the very beginning saying, look, this smells like a lab origin situation. What was it that cracked open the story? It was a piece of independent journalism coming from Nicholas Wade. Yeah. It was not, this is what's crazy, right? It was not on Collective Evolution, although we did cover it. It wasn't in some research journal. It wasn't in the New York Times. It was from Medium, a self-publishing platform. So what does it mean when we have to look to these sources of independent voices to actually get to the truth? This is a very vital part of the situation we're in right now, is that we really just can't attribute validity to a news source. We have to look a lot harder, and we have to look with an open mind. And as you pointed out before, why does this eventually get corrected, months or years later? I think part of the problem is that those of us who understand that the vaccine story is not necessarily what we're being told often rebut people who support the vaccine by saying, no, you're wrong, look at this. No, you're wrong, look at that. And I find the more constructive way of addressing these people is to look at the source that they're giving you
Yeah.
and have the patience to go through it like we just did right here. The point here is not to tell you what is and what isn't. The point here is to look at it objectively and see that even the Washington Post is not irreproachable.
Yeah, and I think this brings up an interesting question that I know we covered in the course that we did on improving critical thinking and overcoming some of our cognitive biases. Which for those that are interested, I mean this is a journey into self that we covered here. A lot of it based on a bunch of sources of biases that Madhava identified in his book Woke, which you can check out in the link in the description. But going through this process, people ask the question, like, do I really have the time and the energy to dive into the sources that the Washington Post has used? Like, isn't the purpose of the Washington Post or Collective Evolution or New York Times, whoever it might be, I think we just named ourselves amongst some, pretty prestigious places. No, but no, like, isn't the point of them to help save the reader time? And it's like, yes, absolutely. But the challenge is what we're seeing. We're at a different time, right? We're at a time where we can't just assume that an alternative media source or a mainstream media source or an independent media source, whatever it might be, is operating from sound logic, reasoning, sources of information, whatever it might be. We're at an unfortunate time in our culture. And I say unfortunate from the standpoint that we have to put effort towards things that we may not have the time to if we want to move towards clarity on something. And that's the reality of our cultural moment. We're just seeing the mainstream media get so many things wrong. They're towing a corporate narrative as opposed to doing objective journalism. And unfortunately, independent media who might be doing that is not seeing the light of day, right? People are not getting access to that information. So it's partly become incumbent upon people to have to navigate this information themselves. And I know that, here we're going to keep creating content that will hopefully hold that true, hold that objectivity true, and put it out there and try and provide some service that helps people move through this stuff a little bit more easily. But that's the nature of the situation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I like the way that you qualified the predicament we're in. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because we're being called to recognize the fact that we have to trust ourselves and not what we're being told. I think this is part of the transformation that's happening in small little pockets like the Collective Evolution community and other alternative media communities. We're starting to see, and some of us are very, very far along with this process about trusting ourselves, and that requires, as you said, an effort. It's no longer sufficient just to trust what you're being told, and it's also requiring us to figure out how to talk to other people, and that's really what I value about Collective Evolution, is that we're not screaming what the truth is. We're asking questions, and this particular piece that we're talking about, I'm not asking questions here, folks. I'm not. I'm telling you that it's bunk. It's it's clearly pointing. This is what's really important. They're pointing out their lack of transparency. It's not easy to get to the bottom of this. You have to figure out what is this rate of adjusted rate of unvaccinated people, and you have to go into their methodology section. Who has the time to go into the methodology section? Not many. You look at the pretty graphs and say, oh my gosh, see, I was right all along. We need to get vaccinated. That's not it at all. They didn't count anybody, and they're quoting epidemiologists saying that this in fact is the truth. They have no basis to claim that, especially as an epidemiologist. That's the problem we're having right now with, and I'm going to be very specific about the vaccine's efficacy. We don't know. We don't know how good the vaccine is. Like, forget about the safety. We don't know how good the vaccine is yet. That's why we do phase 3 trials. They're not done. So you can make your assumptions and say that you're making assumptions. That's not what they did here. Nowhere did they say, well, we're making a very large assumption that, it's hidden. in their methodology section, which I invite everyone to go look at. And that's what's scary when a publication like the Washington Post can they can do whatever they want to. They're not a scientific publication. There's no peer review, but look, they're quoting people and they're making graphs and they have a huge amount of money behind them that allows them to put out Facebook ads indefinitely. And they're trying to get us to buy in with a certain narrative, and they're not being forthright or forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that level of honesty and transparency in what's going on here, I mean, that's been a problem throughout this entire pandemic is skewing numbers, misconflating things, whether it's with testing, whether it's with mask wearing. There's been so much of this throughout the entire pandemic. So for people that are looking at this going, well, what's the point? What does it really matter at the end of the day? It's like, arguably the vast majority of this pandemic, the data we've seen, the guidelines we've been given, are based on the same type of unscientific behavior. So it's at a point where if we don't start holding accountable those that are making these statements and that are directing public policy, then once it goes too far and we're stuck in a surveillance state, we can only blame ourselves.
Yeah, that's the crux of the matter, Joe. Like, look, I know most of us, or a lot of us, are, as you said before, at least in a private conversation, there's COVID fatigue. Like, stop talking about COVID already. Let's get out there and enjoy ourselves. But the story here is that the data, the way it's being presented, has been distorted from the very beginning. And this is yet another example of how that's happening. And it's clearly, in my opinion, a push to get people to get vaccinated. It is sort of an appeal to those who already are vaccinated to convince your vaccine hesitant friends to get in line and get the jab. And if we don't know how to refute or rebut that kind of argument, from legitimate from a legitimate perspective, then we're always going to be fighting.
Yeah, that's well said. And if you want to dive into Madhava's take on this even a little bit further, there is an article posted on Collective Evolution. The link will be in the description, where he dives through some of the science behind why you should question the quote unquote science in the Washington Post article. But yeah, I think that's it. That's all on this piece. What are your thoughts?
That's it. That's all I got to say. We're going to keep it short this time. It was great being with you.